The wind howled across the plains of Colorado Territory like a wounded animal as Colton Everett rode into Fort Collins in the spring of 1876. Blood stained his worn leather duster, though none of it was his own. The townspeople scattered as his midnight stallion thundered down the main street, mud kicking up from beneath powerful hooves. They knew his reputation. They feared the ice in his eyes. Colton had earned his nickname Cold Colton, honestly through years of bounty hunting and gun-slinging. At 32, his face was weathered by the elements. A jagged scar running from his right temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of the night he'd lost everything. He hadn't smiled in 7 years, not since the fire that claimed his wife and infant son, while he was away hunting down a gang of bank robbers. Fort Collins was still a young town, having been established as a military post just over a decade earlier. Now, in 1876, with Colorado on the verge of statehood, the settlement had grown into a proper frontier town with all the expected establishments: a general store, saloon, smithy, and a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse. Colton dismounted outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, his spurs jingling against the wooden sidewalk. He tracked a wanted man named Luther Hanks for 3 weeks across the unforgiving landscape, finally catching him at a camp near the Cache La Powder River. The bounty would buy him whiskey for months. "Sheriff's office is down yonder," a voice called out as Colton retrieved a burlap sack from his saddlebag. He didn't respond, merely spat in the dust and headed in the indicated direction. The sack dripped a dark liquid that left a trail behind him. Sheriff Thomas Mills looked up from his desk as the door swung open, bringing with it the unmistakable stench of death. "Everett," he said flatly, "heard you were in these parts." Colton dropped the sack on the desk with a wet thud. "Luther Hanks, $500. Mills grimaced and opened the sack, turning away almost immediately. "Christ, man, you could have brought him in alive." Poster said dead or alive. Colton's voice was as dry and lifeless as the desert. "He chose dead." The sheriff sighed and pulled out a logbook. "I'll have to verify his identity before I can pay you." "Verify away, I'll be at the saloon." Colton turned to leave when Mills called after him. "We don't want trouble here, Everett. This is a decent town." The bounty hunter paused at the door. "Never do, Sheriff. But trouble has a way of finding me all the same." The Silver Dollar was like every other frontier saloon, smoky, loud, and filled with the competing smells of cheap whiskey, sweat, and perfume. Colton claimed a corner table with his back to the wall, ordered a bottle of whiskey, and settled in to wait for his money. 2 hours and half a bottle later, the saloon doors swung open, momentarily allowing the late afternoon sunlight to penetrate the hazy interior. A woman entered, and the usual cacophony dimmed as men took notice. She wasn't dressed like the saloon girls. Her deep blue dress was modest but well-fitted, and she carried herself with quiet dignity. Bridget Norwood had arrived in Fort Collins just 3 days prior to take ownership of her late uncle's bookshop. At 26, she was considered by many to be well past marrying age, but the death of her parents in Chicago had left her with few options and even less desire for companionship. Books had been her solace, her escape, and now they would be her livelihood. She approached the bar with purpose. "Mr. Hollister, I believe you have a package for me." The stagecoach driver said it was too heavy to bring to the shop. The barkeep nodded. "Yes, madam, got it in the back." "Them books you ordered from Denver, I reckon." "Yes, that's correct. I'd appreciate if you could have someone deliver them to the shop tomorrow morning." "I'll send my boy over first thing," Hollister replied, his eyes darting nervously to where Colton sat. Bridget noticed the man's gaze and turned slightly, catching the cold stare of the bounty hunter. Something in his eyes, an emptiness, A desolation stirred something within her. She'd seen that look before in the mirror after losing her family. Perhaps it was this recognition that prompted her to nod politely in his direction. "Good evening, sir." Colton's expression didn't change. He took another drink and looked away, undeterred. Bridget approached his table. "I don't believe we've met." "I'm Bridget Norwood, the new proprietor of the bookshop." Colton looked up at her, his gray eyes as cold as a winter sky. "Don't need books, madam. Everyone needs books, Mr. Everett, and you're wrong." Bridget smiled gently. "Perhaps you simply haven't found the right one yet." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small leather-bound volume. "I carry this with me everywhere. Whitman's Leaves of Grass, Poetry to Lift the Spirit," Colton scoffed. "Nothing lifts my spirit except whiskey and a paid bounty." "A bounty hunter, then?" "That must be a difficult profession." "It's a living." He poured another drink. "And it keeps me moving." "Running from something, Mr. Everett?" His eyes flashed dangerously. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who doesn't know me, madam. My apologies." "My father always said my curiosity would be the death of me." She smiled again, and something in that smile, genuine, without expectation or judgment, made Colton pause mid-drink. "Your books are waiting," he said finally. "Best not keep them lonely." Bridget nodded. "Of course. But should you ever find yourself in need of company that doesn't burn your throat or cloud your mind, my shop is just down the street. The conversation is free, even if the books are not." As she turned to leave, Colton found himself watching her retreating figure with unexpected interest. It had been years since anyone had approached him without fear or an ulterior motive. Years since someone had spoken to him as a man rather than a legend or a threat. He drained his glass and poured another, trying to chase away the unsettling feeling her kindness had stirred within him. The next morning, Colton woke in his rented room above the saloon with a pounding headache and the lingering memory of dreams he'd rather forget. He dressed quickly, strapped on his Colt Peacemaker, and headed downstairs for coffee strong enough to raise the dead. As he stepped into the street, squinting against the harsh morning sunlight, he noticed a commotion near the general store. A man was shouting at a young boy who couldn't have been more than 12, his face red with anger as he accused the child of theft. "I didn't steal nothing." The boy protested, tears streaming down his dirty face. "I was just looking." "Liars get the strap," the man growled, reaching for his belt. Something stirred in Colton's chest, a memory, perhaps, of another boy long ago. Before he realized what he was doing, he found himself striding toward the scene. "That's enough," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable threat. The man turned, recognition and fear dawning on his face. "This ain't your business, Everett," making it my business. Colton placed himself between the man and the boy. "Kid says he didn't steal. What you lose?" Piece of candy went missing right after he was hanging around. Colton reached into his pocket and tossed a coin at the man. "There. Paid for twice over. Now go about your day." The man caught the coin, looked like he might argue, then thought better of it and retreated into his store. Colton turned to the boy, who stared up at him with wide eyes. "You did take it, didn't you?" The boy's lower lip trembled. "My sister's sick. Wanted to bring her something sweet." Colton grunted. "Next time, work for what you want. Stealing's a quick path to a noose." He turned to leave. "Mister," the boy called after him. "Thanks. Nobody stands up for me except Miss Norwood sometimes." Colton paused. "The bookshop lady," the boy nodded enthusiastically. "She lets me read in her shop even though I ain't got money for books. Says learnin's more important than profit." With a non-committal grunt, Colton continued on his way. But instead of returning to the saloon, he found himself wandering down the street toward a freshly painted storefront with Norwood Books and Stationery written in elegant gold lettering on the window. He hesitated outside, watching through the glass as Bridget assisted an elderly gentleman with selecting a book. Her face was animated as she spoke, her hands gesturing expressively. When she smiled, it reached her eyes a genuine expression that Colton had almost forgotten existed in this harsh world. Before he could reconsider, he pushed open the door, a small bell announcing his entrance. Bridget looked up, surprise briefly crossing her features before being replaced with that same warm smile. "Mr. Everett, how wonderful to see you." She finished with her customer, then approached him. "Have you reconsidered your position on books?" Colton shifted uncomfortably. "Just passing by." "Well, I'm glad you passed by inside rather than out." She gestured around the shop. "Feel free to browse. I just received a shipment of new titles from Denver." The shop was smaller than it appeared from outside, but every inch was efficiently used. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and freestanding cases created narrow aisles throughout the space. A small reading area with 2 comfortable chairs sat near the front window, and a counter with a cash register stood at the back. "You live here too?" Colton asked, noting a door behind the counter. Bridget nodded. "There's an apartment upstairs. It's modest, but it suits me well enough." "Alone?" She raised an eyebrow at the question. "Yes, Mr. Everett, quite alone." He cleared his throat. "Isn't safe for a woman." "Perhaps not, but necessity rarely concerns itself with safety." She studied him for a moment. "I heard what you did for young Jamie this morning. That was kind of you." Colton frowned. "News travels fast. It's a small town, and kindness is noteworthy, especially from a man with your reputation." "And what exactly have you heard about me, Miss Norwood?" She held his gaze steadily. "That you're dangerous. That you hunt men for money. That you've killed more than you can count." She paused. "But I've also heard that you bring in the worst of the worst men who prey on the innocent." Colton walked to one of the bookshelves, running his fingers along the spines without really seeing the titles. "Don't make me into something I'm not, madam. I hunt for the bounty, not for justice." "Perhaps," Bridget replied, "but you could choose easier prey if money were your only concern." He turned to face her. "You talk a lot for someone who sells books. Books are just collections of words, Mr. Everett. Words have power. They can wound or heal, condemn or redeem." She took a step closer. "The right words at the right time can change a life." Something about her earnestness made him uncomfortable. It had been so long since anyone had looked at him and seen anything worth saving. "You selling those words too?" he asked gruffly. To his surprise, she laughed, a clear, genuine sound that seemed to brighten the shop. "Those I give freely, Mr. Everett, though I admit they're not always welcomed." Despite himself, Colton felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but the closest he'd come in years. "Got any books on tracking?" Bridget's eyes lit up. "As a matter of fact, I do. I have a fascinating volume on Native American tracking methods. Would you like to see it?" For the next hour, Colton found himself engaged in the first real conversation he'd had in longer than he could remember. Bridget was knowledgeable about her inventory and seemed genuinely interested in his experiences on the frontier. She didn't flinch when he mentioned his profession, nor did she romanticize it as some women did. When the door opened again, admitting a group of ladies from the local church committee, Bridget excused herself to assist them. Colton, suddenly aware of how long he'd stayed, purchased the tracking book and left without saying goodbye. That night, in his room above the saloon, Colton opened the book. A slip of paper fell out, a note written in flowing script. "Mr. Everett, words may not heal all wounds, but they can keep us company in our darkest hours. You are welcome in my shop anytime, whether to browse, to purchase, or simply to talk. Sometimes a kind word is the only light we need to find our way. B." Norwood, he stared at the note for a long time before carefully folding it and placing it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Over the next week, Colton found himself returning to the bookshop under various pretenses to ask about a historical book on the Civil War, to inquire if she had any maps of the territory, to return the tracking book, which he had actually read cover to cover. Each visit lasted longer than the previous one, and each time, Bridget welcomed him with the same warm smile and genuine interest in what he had to say. On his fifth visit, he arrived to find the shop closed during regular business hours. Concerned, he knocked on the door. When there was no answer, he moved to the side of the building where a narrow staircase led to the apartment above. He hesitated, then climbed the stairs and knocked on the door. "Miss Norwood, it's Colton Everett." After a moment, the door opened slightly, revealing Bridget's pale face. "Mr. Everett, I'm afraid I'm not feeling well today. The shop will be closed until tomorrow." Colton frowned. "You sick? Need a doctor? Just a headache? I'll be fine with rest." She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're lying," he said bluntly. "What's wrong?" Bridget's composure cracked slightly. "It's nothing you can help with, Mr. Everett. Try me." She hesitated, then opened the door wider. "I received a letter from the bank this morning. My uncle apparently took out a loan against the shop shortly before his death. I have 30 days to pay it or lose everything." Colton stepped into the small apartment. It was simply furnished but cozy, with books piled on every surface. "How much?" $200. She sank into a chair by the window. "It might as well be 2,000. The shop barely breaks even as it is." Colton stood awkwardly in the center of the room, his hat in his hands. "No," she interrupted firmly. "I appreciate the thought, Mr. Everett, but I don't accept charity. I'll find a way." He nodded, respecting her pride. "The bank manager, that'd be Harold Simmons." "Yes. Do you know him?" Colton's expression darkened. "We've crossed paths. He's not known for his generosity." "He made that quite clear." Bridget sighed and rubbed her temples. "I'm sorry, Mr. Everett. I'm poor company today." "Colton," he said abruptly. "Pardon, my name. It's Colton. Friends use it." A genuine smile broke through her worry. "Are we friends, then?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Reckon we might be. Then please call me Bridget." She stood and moved to a small kitchen area. "Would you like some tea, Colton? It's the least I can offer for your concern." They sat together by the window, drinking tea and watching the townspeople pass by on the street below. Colton told her about his latest bounty, a cattle rustler who'd surrendered without a fight, and Bridget spoke of her childhood in Chicago, of her parents' bookshop that had been her first home. "Why Fort Collins?" Colton asked. "Seems a long way from Chicago." "My uncle wrote to me after my parents died. Said he was getting old and had no one to leave the shop to. Asked if I'd consider coming west." She stared into her teacup. "I had nothing left in Chicago but memories, so I came. He died 3 months later, heart failure." "You regret it, coming here?" Bridget considered the question. "No. Despite everything, I don't. There's something about the openness here, the possibility. In Chicago, everyone knew who I was expected to be. Here, I can define myself." Colton nodded, understanding completely. "Freedom's worth a lot." "Yes," she agreed, looking at him intently. "Though sometimes I think true freedom comes from connecting to others, not from isolation." Her words hit too close to the walls he'd built around himself. Colton stood abruptly. "Should let you rest. Got business to attend to anyway." If she was disappointed by his sudden departure, Bridget didn't show it. "Thank you for checking on me, Colton. It means more than you know." As he left the apartment, Colton was troubled by the depth of his concern for her situation. He'd spent 7 years keeping people at a distance. And in just a week, this woman with her kind words and genuine smiles had somehow slipped past his defenses. Later that afternoon, Colton found himself outside the Fort Collins Bank and Trust. Harold Simmons was just locking up for the day when Colton approached. "Everett," Simmons said cautiously, "what brings you to my establishment? Heard you're calling in Norwood's loan." The banker's eyes narrowed. "That's between the bank and Miss Norwood, not your concern." "Making it my concern." Colton stepped closer, his voice low. "Seems mighty convenient calling it in right after old man Norwood passes. Business is business." The terms were clear. Simmons straightened his waistcoat nervously. "Besides, a woman has no business running a shop on her own. The building could be put to better use." "By who?" Simmons hesitated. "There have been inquiries." "Jameson," Colton guessed, naming the owner of the largest saloon in town, located just 2 buildings down from Bridget's shop. The banker's silence confirmed his suspicion. Colton had heard rumors that Jameson wanted to expand his operation, creating the largest entertainment venue in northern Colorado territory. "Miss Norwood has 30 days by law," Simmons said defensively. "If she can pay, she keeps the shop. Simple as that." Colton leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I find out you're not playing this straight, Simmons, you'll be seeing me again, and it won't be for banking business." He left the banker sputtering indignantly and headed for the sheriff's office. Mills looked up in surprise when Colton entered. "Everett, thought you'd be halfway to Wyoming by now. Any bounties worth pursuing?" Mills raised an eyebrow. Suddenly interested in staying local, Colton didn't respond, merely waited. The sheriff shuffled through some papers on his desk. "Nothing big. Got a horse thief operating near Laramie, $50, and there's a counterfeiter who might be heading this way from Denver, $120 for him." "I'll take both." Mills handed him the wanted posters. "Since when do you hunt small game, Everett?" Colton tucked the posters into his coat. "Man's got to eat." For the next 2 weeks, Colton took on every bounty within riding distance of Fort Collins. Between hunts, he spent his evenings at Bridget's shop, sometimes helping her reorganize shelves or repair bindings on damaged books. She taught him to appreciate poetry, reading aloud from Whitman and Wordsworth as they sat in the reading area after closing. In turn, he found himself sharing stories of his travels, sanitized versions that omitted the violence, but included the beauty he'd seen across the frontier. He told her about the stars over the desert, so bright they seemed close enough to touch, about the mountains in springtime, covered in wildflowers of every color, about the vast prairies that stretched to the horizon like an ocean of grass. One evening, as they sat together in comfortable silence, Bridget reading while Colton cleaned his revolver, she asked the question he'd been dreading. "What happened to make you so?" She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Cold," he supplied. "Guarded," she corrected gently. Colton's hand stilled. He stared at the disassembled weapon before him, seeing instead a burning cabin, hearing screams that had haunted his dreams for 7 years. "Had a wife once. And a son," he said finally, his voice rough. "Sarah and little Thomas. We had a small ranch outside Santa Fe. I was gone hunting bounties more than I was home. Told myself it was to provide for them, but truth is, I liked the freedom of the trail." Bridget set her book aside, giving him her full attention but not interrupting. "There was a gang I'd been tracking, the Hatcher brothers. I'd brought in their youngest for robbery and he hanged. The others swore revenge." His jaw tightened. "I was gone after another bounty when they found our ranch, burned it to the ground with Sarah and Thomas inside." "Oh, Colton," Bridget whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Tracked them down, one by one. Took me almost a year." His voice was flat, emotionless. "By the time I put the last one in the ground, there wasn't much of me left, just the cold." In the silence that followed, Bridget reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He stared at their joined hands, unable to remember the last time anyone had touched him with such tenderness. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. "Don't matter now," he replied, withdrawing his hand and resuming his work on the revolver. "It matters," Bridget insisted. "The past shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us. You've survived unimaginable loss, Colton. That you can still show kindness to Jamie, to me speaks to the man you truly are." He looked up at her then, struck by the earnestness in her eyes. "You see good where there isn't any. I see a man who's been carrying a heavy burden alone for too long." She smiled sadly. "I understand something about that. After my parents died, I thought I'd never feel whole again. Books were my escape, but they were also my prison. I was hiding from living. And now I'm trying to build something new, to honor their memory by living fully, not by shutting down." She reached for his hand again, and this time he didn't pull away. "We can't bring them back, Colton, but we can choose not to join them in death while we're still breathing." Her words found a crack in the armor around his heart. For the first time in 7 years, Colton felt something stir within him, not quite hope, but perhaps the possibility of it. 3 days later, Colton returned from tracking the counterfeiter, bringing the man in alive to claim the bounty. As he collected his payment from Sheriff Mills, he asked casually about Bridget's situation with the bank. "Heard anything about Simmons and the Norwood loan?" Mills frowned. "Funny you should ask. Just yesterday, Jameson was in here, talking about his plans for expanding his saloon. Mentioned he'd already made arrangements to acquire the bookshop property." Colton's expression darkened. "She's got another 2 weeks by law. That's what I told him. He just smiled and said some debts come due early." Mills studied Colton's face. "You've been spending a lot of time with Miss Norwood. She's a friend." "Uh-huh." The sheriff didn't look convinced. "Well, your friend might need to watch her back. Jameson doesn't like competition, and Simmons does whatever Jameson tells him to." Colton pocketed his bounty money. "Appreciate the information, Sheriff." As he left the office, Colton calculated his savings. Between the bounties he'd collected over the past 2 weeks and what he had saved previously, he had enough to cover Bridget's loan. But he knew she wouldn't accept the money outright. He was still pondering this problem as he approached the bookshop. Through the window, he could see Bridget helping a customer, a well-dressed woman he recognized as the banker's wife, Mrs. Simmons. Curious, Colton waited outside until the woman left, then entered the shop. Bridget looked up with a bright smile. "Colton, you're back safely." "Caught him in Cheyenne," he confirmed. "Hardly put up a fight." "I'm glad to hear it was uneventful." She came around the counter to greet him properly. "I missed our evening discussions." The simple admission warmed something in Colton's chest. "Saw Mrs. Simmons leaving. Everything all right?" Bridget's smile faltered slightly. "She came to warn me, actually. Apparently, her husband and Mr. Jameson have some arrangement regarding my shop. She overheard them discussing how to expedite matters, meaning, I'm not entirely sure, but she suggested I should be careful." Bridget wrapped her arms around herself. "I've been thinking, Colton, perhaps it's time I return to Chicago. My parents' old assistant still runs their shop. He might need help." The thought of Bridget leaving created a panic in Colton that caught him off guard. "You can't leave," he said more forcefully than he intended. She looked at him in surprise. "I may not have a choice. I've tried everything. The shop isn't profitable enough to save within the time frame I have left." "What if—" Colton hesitated, then pressed on. "What if we were partners? I've got savings, could invest in the shop, give you time to make it profitable." Bridget's eyes widened. "Colton, I couldn't possibly accept that. It's not charity, it's business." He paced the small shop. "I've been thinking about settling somewhere, getting tired of the trail." "Here, in Fort Collins?" She sounded incredulous. "What would you do?" He stopped pacing and faced her. Don't know yet, but I've got skills beyond hunting men. Was a rancher once, could be again. The hope in Bridget's eyes made his heart beat faster. You're serious, dead serious. He approached her slowly. But there's a condition. What's that? You let me help you deal with Jameson and Simmons, my way. Bridget frowned. I don't want violence, Colton. No violence, he promised. Just a different kind of negotiation. Trust me. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. I trust you. The next day, Colton visited Harold Simmons at the bank, this time during business hours. The lobby fell silent as he entered, his reputation preceding him. Simmons looked up from his desk and visibly paled. Mr. Everett, what can I do for you today? Colton approached the desk calmly. I'd like to discuss Miss Norwood's loan. Simmons glanced nervously at the other customers. That's a private matter between the bank and I'm her business partner now, Colton interrupted. Making it my business. Partner? Simmons looked skeptical. That's right. Colton placed a leather pouch on the desk. $200, paying off the loan in full. Simmons stared at the pouch, then back at Colton. Well, this is unexpected. There's paperwork to be completed, of course. Then complete it. Now. The banker hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Mr. Jameson had expressed interest in that property. He won't be pleased. Not your concern anymore. Colton leaned forward. Unless you'd like me to discuss with the sheriff how convenient it was that this loan surfaced right after old man Norwood died. Might make folks wonder if the loan was legitimate at all. Simmons' face reddened. Are you accusing me of fraud? Just thinking out loud. Colton's voice was casual, but his eyes were cold. Be a shame if such talk affected your standing in town. After a tense moment, Simmons reached for the pouch. I'll prepare the receipt and deed release immediately. Wise choice. Later that afternoon, Colton presented Bridget with the documents showing the loan had been paid in full. She stared at the papers in disbelief. How did you manage this? Simmons wouldn't even discuss terms with me. Colton shrugged. Some men respond better to certain approaches. Used my reputation to advantage for once. But the money, my investment in our partnership, he insisted. We'll draw up proper papers, everything legal and above board. Tears welled in Bridget's eyes. I don't know how to thank you, Colton. No need for thanks. It's practical. He looked around the shop. Place needs work, though, thinking we could expand the inventory. Maybe add a section for maps and guides. Lots of settlers coming through who need reliable information about the territory. Bridget laughed through her tears. You've given this some thought. Been thinking about a lot of things lately. He met her gaze directly. Things I thought were dead and buried. Her breath caught at the intensity in his eyes. Colton, the shop door burst open, cutting off her words. Victor Jameson stormed in, his face contorted with rage. What the hell do you think you're doing, Everett? That property was as good as mine. Colton stepped in front of Bridget protectively. Shop's not for sale, Jameson. Never was. We had an arrangement, Simmons and I. Jameson's hand hovered near his hip where a revolver was holstered. Whatever arrangement you had is done. Miss Norwood's loan is paid and I'm her partner now. Colton's voice was calm, but his stance was alert. You're welcome to build your saloon elsewhere. Jameson's eyes narrowed. You threatening me, bounty hunter, stating facts. Shop stays a shop. Miss Norwood stays its owner. Colton took a step forward. Unless you've got a problem with that. The saloon owner looked from Colton to Bridget, calculating his odds. Despite his anger, Jameson was no fool. Colton Everett's reputation wasn't built on empty threats. This isn't over, Jameson snarled, backing toward the door. You've made an enemy today, Everett. Wouldn't be the first. Colton didn't move until Jameson had left, slamming the door behind him. Bridget released a shaky breath. Will he cause trouble? Probably, Colton admitted. But nothing we can't handle. She studied his face, searching for something. You're really staying in Fort Collins if you'll have me." His voice softened. "As a partner, at least. For now." The qualifying phrase hung in the air between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. In the weeks that followed, Colton threw himself into his new role with surprising enthusiasm. He built new shelving, reorganized the stockroom for efficiency, and even designed a display case for the front window. When he wasn't working on the shop, he was scouting properties outside town, considering his options for the future. True to Colton's prediction, Jameson attempted to cause problems, spreading rumors about the nature of Colton and Bridget's relationship, hiring local boys to deface the shop front, even trying to intercept book deliveries. But each attempt was met with Colton's quiet, determined resistance and Bridget's unwavering dignity. What neither of them had anticipated was how the conflict would actually improve business. The townspeople, many of whom had been intimidated by Jameson for years, began to frequent the bookshop out of a combination of curiosity and support. Mothers brought their children for Story Hour, which Bridget had started hosting on Saturday mornings. Ranchers came to purchase the practical guides and maps that Colton had added to the inventory. Even Sheriff Mills became a regular customer, claiming that reading westerns helped him understand the criminal mind. One evening in late summer, as Colton and Bridget closed up the shop after a particularly profitable day, she turned to him with a triumphant smile. "We did it, Colton. The shop made enough this month to cover expenses and start repaying your investment." He nodded in satisfaction. "Told you it would work." "Yes, you did." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Have you decided about the Thompson property? It's a good piece of land." Colton had been considering purchasing a small ranch about 5 miles outside of town. The previous owner had died without heirs, and the bank was selling it at a fair price. "Thinking on it still," he replied. "It's good land, but 5 miles is a fair distance from town, from the shop." The implication hung between them. Over the past months, they had developed a comfortable routine, working together at the shop during the day, sharing meals and conversation in the evenings. Neither had put words to the deepening connection between them. "It is," Bridget agreed softly. "Though I suppose you could always ride in." "Could," he acknowledged, "or could find something closer. Closer would be nice." She met his gaze directly. "I've grown accustomed to your company, Colton Everett." Something in her voice, in the way she said his name, gave him courage. "Bridget, I'm not good with words like you are." "Never have been. But these past months—" He trailed off, struggling to articulate the transformation she had wrought in him with her kindness, her patience, her unwavering belief in his capacity for goodness. "Yes," she prompted gently. "You brought me back to life," he said simply. "Didn't know I was still living in that burning cabin until you pulled me out with your words." Tears welled in her eyes. "Oh, Colton." He took a tentative step toward her. "Don't know what I can offer you. Still got blood on my hands. Still got nightmares. But whatever I am, whatever I have, it's yours if you want it." Bridget closed the distance between them, placing her hands on his chest. "What I want is the man standing before me now. The one who defends children, who builds bookshelves, who reads poetry by lamplight. The one who's learning to live again, just as I am." Colton covered her hands with his own. "That man's still finding his way. Then we'll find it together." She smiled up at him. "One kind word at a time." His kiss was gentle, almost hesitant, the kiss of a man who had forgotten the language of tenderness and was learning it anew. Bridget responded with a warmth that melted the last of the ice around his heart. When they finally parted, Colton rested his forehead against hers. "Think I'll pass on the Thompson property," he murmured. Seems to me there's plenty of room above this shop for two people who don't mind close quarters. Bridget's laughter was bright with joy. Mr. Everett, are you proposing an arrangement? Proposing marriage, Miss Norwood, if you'll have me. Her answer was another kiss, this one filled with promise and possibility. They were married in the small church on a crisp October day, with Sheriff Mills serving as Colton's best man and Mrs. Simmons, who had become a devoted customer and friend, standing up for Bridget. Even Harold Simmons attended, though Jameson was notably absent, having left town the previous month after losing his saloon in a poker game. As winter settled over Fort Collins, bringing with it the promise of Colorado's first official Christmas as a state, Colton and Bridget expanded their business plans. The shop now included a small lending library for those who couldn't afford to purchase books, and Colton had started offering tracking and survival classes for the influx of settlers heading west. One snowy evening, as they sat by the fire in their apartment above the shop, Bridget reading aloud while Colton worked on a leather-bound journal he was crafting for her Christmas gift, she paused mid-sentence. "Colton, I've been thinking." He looked up, recognizing the particular tone in her voice that meant she had been considering something important. About the future, our future." She set her book aside. "What would you think about adding to our family?" The question caught him off guard. The memory of little Thomas, of the life he'd lost, flashed through his mind, but it was no longer accompanied by the searing pain he'd carried for so long. Instead, there was a bittersweet acknowledgement of what had been, coupled with hope for what might be. "You want children?" he asked carefully. Bridget nodded. "I do, with you." She reached for his hand. "But only if you feel ready. I know it might stir difficult memories." Colton set aside the journal and moved to kneel before her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Sarah and Thomas will always be part of me. But you've taught me that honoring their memory doesn't mean stopping my own life." He swallowed hard. "Nothing would make me prouder than raising a family with you, Bridget Everett." Her smile was radiant. "I was hoping you'd say that. Any particular reason for asking now?" He questioned, suddenly suspicious of her expression. Bridget's smile turned mischievous. "Let's just say that by next summer we might need to convert the stockroom into a nursery." Colton froze, his eyes widening as her meaning registered. "You're not entirely certain yet," she admitted. "But I'm late, and I've been feeling different these past few weeks." A surge of emotions, fear, joy, wonder, protective fierceness washed over Colton. Without a word, he gathered Bridget into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious material on earth. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "A new beginning," she replied softly, "for all of us." Spring brought confirmation of Bridget's pregnancy and a flourishing business. The people of Fort Collins had embraced the transformed bookshop as a community gathering place. On Saturday afternoons, Colton could be found teaching boys and girls alike how to read tracts and signs in the dirt lot behind the shop, while Bridget held court inside with reading circles for children and adults. In June of 1877, as wildflowers painted the Colorado plains in vibrant colors, Bridget gave birth to a son whom they named William James Everett, William for Bridget's father, James for Colton's. As Colton held his newborn son for the first time, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face, he marveled at the journey that had brought him to this moment. 7 years ago, he had ridden away from the ashes of his life, his heart as cold and dead as the winter ground. He had existed rather than lived, moving from bounty to bounty without purpose beyond survival and revenge. And then Bridget had spoken to him, really spoken to him, when everyone else saw only the legend, the killer, the man to be feared. With nothing but kind words and unwavering belief, She had thawed what he thought was permanently frozen. "He has your eyes," Bridget said softly from the bed, her face tired but radiant with happiness. Colton looked down at the tiny face nestled in the crook of his arm. The baby's eyes were indeed gray like his own, but they held none of the coldness that had defined Colton for so long. They were clear, curious, full of all the possibility that new life brings. "And your heart, I hope," Colton replied, gently touching the downy hair on his son's head. "Your capacity for seeing the good in people." Bridget reached out her hand, and Colton carefully sat on the edge of the bed, cradling their son between them. "He'll have both our strengths and his own," she said, "and he'll grow up knowing he's loved beyond measure." Colton leaned forward to kiss her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what? For not giving up on me, for seeing past the cold." His voice was rough with emotion, "for giving me a reason to live again." Bridget's smile was tender as she touched his cheek. "You always had the capacity for warmth, Colton. It was just buried beneath your pain. All I did was remind you it was there." "All you did," he echoed with a soft laugh, "was save me with nothing but kind words." As if in agreement, little William made a small sound, his tiny hand gripping Colton's finger with surprising strength. It was a new hold on life for the child just beginning his journey, and for the father who had found his way back from the darkest wilderness. Outside their window, the Colorado sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples as it set behind the mountains. Another day was ending, but for the Everett family, it was just the beginning. By 1882, Norwood and Everett Books had expanded to include a second location in the growing city of Denver. Colton split his time between managing the Fort Collins shop and traveling to Denver once a month to oversee the newer store, which was run day to day by a young man named Michael, who had been their first employee in Fort Collins. William, now 5 years old, was a curious and adventurous child with his mother's love of books and his father's keen observational skills. He had been joined by a 3-year-old sister, Sarah Elizabeth, named for Colton's first wife and Bridget's mother, who, despite her young age, already showed signs of being as strong-willed as both her parents. On a warm September evening, as Colton returned from a 3-day hunting trip with Sheriff Mills, now retired and serving as the town's unofficial historian, he found Bridget sitting on the porch of the small house they had built 2 years earlier on the outskirts of Fort Collins. The children were playing in the yard, William teaching Sarah how to track by following the trail of breadcrumbs he had laid. "Successful trip?" Bridget asked as he dismounted and secured his horse. Colton climbed the steps and kissed her before answering. "Got enough venison to last through winter, and Mills caught more fish than he knew what to do with." "Good. Mrs. Mills sent word that they'll host the harvest dinner this year." Bridget made room for him on the bench beside her. "You had a visitor while you were gone." Something in her tone made him pause. "Who?" "A young man named Richard Hanks." She watched his face carefully. "He said he's Luther Hanks' son." Colton went very still. Luther Hanks had been one of his bounties years ago, the man whose head he'd brought to Sheriff Mills in a sack the day he'd first met Bridget. What did he want? To meet the man who killed his father. Bridget took Colton's hand. "He's 16, Colton. He was just a boy when it happened." Colton watched his children playing, thinking of the stark differences between his life now and what it had been. "Did you tell him where to find me?" "I told him you'd be back today. He's staying at the hotel." She squeezed his hand. "He doesn't seem angry, just searching for answers, perhaps." Colton nodded slowly. "I'll go see him after supper." The hotel was quiet when Colton entered that evening. The clerk directed him to a small room on the second floor. When he knocked, the door was opened by a lanky young man with features that clearly marked him as Luther Hanks' son. "Mr. Everett." The boy's voice cracked slightly. "Thank you for coming." Colton nodded, removing his hat as he entered the sparse room. "Your name's Richard." "Yes, sir, Richard Hanks." The boy gestured awkwardly to the room's only chair. "Would you like to sit? I'll stand." Colton studied the young man, seeing both the father he'd killed and an innocence that the elder Hanks had long since lost. "Your wife said you wanted to meet me." Richard sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I've been tracking you for almost a year, sir. Ever since I found my father's wanted poster in my mother's things after she passed. Sorry about your mother." "Thank you." The boy took a deep breath. "I don't remember much about my father. He left when I was 7 and mother never spoke of him. But when I found that poster with your name written on it, I started asking questions." Colton remained silent, waiting. "They say you were the best bounty hunter in the territories, that you never gave up once you took a contract." Richard looked up, meeting Colton's eyes directly. "They also say my father killed 12 people before you caught him." 13, Colton corrected quietly. "There was a young woman in Santa Fe they didn't know about when they printed the poster." Richard nodded, absorbing this information. "I needed to know if he was as bad as they said. If he swallowed hard, if he deserved what he got." Colton considered his words carefully. This was no longer the cold-hearted bounty hunter speaking to the son of a kill, but a father speaking to someone's child. "Your father made choices, Richard. Bad ones. He hurt people who didn't deserve hurting." Colton moved to the window, looking out at the town he now called home. "But that doesn't mean there wasn't good in him once, maybe even at the end. Did he fight you?" "No," Colton admitted. "When I caught up to him, he was sick. Fever from an infected wound, could barely stand, let alone draw. But you killed him anyway." There was no accusation in Richard's voice, just a need to understand. Colton turned back to face the boy. "I was a different man then. Cold. Revenge was all I lived for after losing my family. I didn't see people, just bounties." He paused, the weight of his past heavy on him. "If I found your father today, I'd bring him in alive to face justice." Richard seemed to consider this. "My mother always said I wasn't anything like him, that I had her heart." "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was." The boy stood straighter now, as if a burden had been lifted. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Everett, for telling me the truth." Colton nodded. "What will you do now?" "Head back to Missouri. I'm apprenticed to a carpenter there." A small smile appeared. "I'm good with my hands. Building things instead of tearing them down. That's a good path." Colton reached into his pocket and pulled out some bills. "For your journey back." Richard started to refuse, but something in Colton's expression stopped him. This wasn't charity, it was a kind of restitution. "Thank you, sir." As Colton turned to leave, the boy called after him. "Mr. Everett, the lady at the bookshop, your wife, she said something that made me decide to wait for you instead of moving on." Colton paused at the door. "What's that?" "She said that sometimes the greatest act of courage is to face your past so you can truly live in your present." Richard smiled slightly. "She said you taught her that." Colton felt a warmth spread through his chest. "My wife is a wise woman too, wiser than I deserve." Later that night, as Colton and Bridget lay in bed, he told her about the meeting with Richard Hanks. "You did a good thing," she said, nestling against his chest. "He's a good kid, better than his father deserved to raise." Colton stroked her hair absently. "Got me thinking, though." "About what?" "About legacy. About what we leave behind." He shifted to look at her in the moonlight filtering through their window. "The name Cold Colton used to be what I was known for. Now it's Norwood and Everett Books. Building instead of destroying, like the Hanks boy said." Bridget smiled. "You've built quite a lot, Colton Everett. A business, a home, a family." "We built it," he corrected, pulling her closer. "Together." "Yes, together." She traced the scar on his face gently. From the moment you walked into my shop with that scowl that scared everyone but me." Colton laughed softly. "Wasn't scared of anything until I met you, then I was terrified. Of little old me," she teased, "of how you made me feel, of wanting something I could lose again." His voice grew serious. "Of hoping." Bridget kissed him tenderly. "Hope is the most dangerous feeling, isn't it? But also the most necessary. You taught me that." He cupped her face in his hands. "You and your kind words broke through when nothing else could." As they drifted to sleep in each other's arms, Colton reflected on the journey that had brought him from that blood-soaked day in Fort Collins to this peaceful night in a home filled with love. The cold that had defined him for so long had given way to warmth, the isolation to connection, the vengeance to purpose. And it had started with a woman brave enough to see past his reputation, wise enough to offer kindness instead of fear, and patient enough to wait as his frozen heart slowly thawed beneath the gentle persistence of her words. In the years that followed, Colton and Bridget's legacy continued to grow. Their bookshops expanded to include locations in Cheyenne and Santa Fe. William followed in his parents' footsteps, combining his father's tracking skills and his mother's love of words to become a noted author of guides for settlers and travelers in the West. Sarah, with her mother's determination and her father's protective instincts, became one of Colorado's first female attorneys, advocating for those who couldn't speak for themselves. And when visitors to Fort Collins asked about the distinguished couple who owned the original Norwood and Everett books, locals would often share the story of how the notorious bounty hunter known as Cold Colton had been transformed by the kindness of a bookshop owner, a testament to the enduring power of words spoken with compassion, and the capacity of even the most wounded heart to heal when touched by love.